Scripture reading for today is Matthew chapter 20, verse 20 to 28, which can be found on page 674 of your, chair Bible, or on 1420 of my large print Bible, which I'll be reading from. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to him with her sons kneeling down and asking something from him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Grant that these two sons of mine may sit one at your right hand and the other on the left in your kingdom." But Jesus answered and said, "You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They said to him, "We are able." So he said to them, "You will indeed drink my cup and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it is for those to whom it is prepared by my Father." And when the 10 heard of it, they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. But Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to be great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many."
Well, good morning. So good to see you guys today. Make sure I'm on here. A couple of things before we get into the sermon. First of all, this coming Saturday, we have oil change day coming up. Every year we do free oil changes for single moms, for elderly people, for basically people who can't afford it. And I have to tell you, we put the registrations up, and our registrations are full. We had to take the form down because we can't take any more cars. So we had 27 cars registered. Now, not everyone always shows up. We'll contact them ahead of time to make sure that they do, because if someone signs up and they don't show up, then they're taking a spot away from someone else. So we'll make sure we make some contacts. Now, we do have a good number of techs, a good number of people who will do hospitality and all of that, but we can always use more. So if you would like to help out with the free oil change, there's the information card on your bulletin, and you can just write your name on there and then write oil change and then either mechanic or hospitality, and we'll get in touch with you this week with some of the details. The event itself goes from 9 until about 2 o'clock or so, but we'll meet at 8 o'clock and we'll pray together, and then we'll get everything set up and ready to go for our guests to come, and we'll change a lot of oil in a lot of cars. So it's an exciting time for sure. Also, we need candy for the Halloween station that we're going to do on Halloween, October 31st. So you have a few weeks to do that. You can bring them on Sunday morning and just drop them off here in the Commons, or you can bring them to the office during the week. But we need lots and lots of candy, so if you can find a bag of them. And it's a little bit better than Easter, actually, not the holiday itself, but the candy part, because you can bring whatever size candy you want. They don't have to fit into Easter eggs or anything like that. So bring whatever candy you want, and we'll connect with kids in the neighborhood this year. Finally, before we get into the message, something that I think is worth mentioning is, and Dwayne alluded to it in his prayer, but one of our longtime members, and I think for many, many years, one of the pillars of our church, Joan Kindy, passed away this week. And, normally when you say someone passed away, there's a deep sadness, and actually there is. Obviously, we will miss her. But also, she was 87 years old. And she lived a great life, and actually this is something that she was looking forward to. Not because she was depressed, not because she was in despair, but she wanted to see Jesus. And for the last couple of years, her health had been deteriorating. She had been in a nursing home. And, it was hard to see her in that condition, hard to see her suffering. Or in many ways, I think her mind was working, but her mouth couldn't get words out, and she couldn't do the things that she wanted to do. But today we're going to be talking about giving ourselves for the glory of God and for the good of the world. And man, for those of you who knew Joan, you know that that's what she was about. And for those of you who didn't have the privilege of knowing Joan, you really missed out. But in a couple of weeks, on September 21st, starting at 11 o'clock, we're going to have a memorial service for her right here. And I know we're going to be live streaming it because there's going to be people all around the world who are going to be eager to participate in that live stream. But I thought it was worth mentioning because she was just a great woman of God. Did many, many things for the kingdom, and we just have a great appreciation for her. So, all right. Well, let's get into the message here. I'm sure you've heard it said many times that we live in what's called a consumeristic society. Of course, the question is, what does that mean to live in a consumerist society? Well, let me talk about a few signs of a consumerist society, see if you recognize these in ours. First of all, it's a society where people buy things not just because of their usefulness, but to boost their image or their status. Okay? Now, there have always been people like this. Clothes have always been a way of showing someone's wealth and all of that, but the general population could not really afford to do that, and also in many cultures today, they can't afford to do that as well. But when I was growing up, and probably it still happens here too, even people who could barely afford to pay their rent were buying $200 Air Jordans because it gave them a kind of status with their peers. Okay, that's the kind of society that we live with. It's also a society where a high percentage of purchases are made simply for fun or pleasure or entertainment. Today, there's actually a thing called retail therapy, where if someone is depressed or if they're feeling hopeless, they go shopping to make themselves feel better. And, I show a little bit of outrage about that, but to tell you the truth, I've gotten that sometimes shopping on Amazon, just waiting for my package to come, right? You've probably felt some of that too, right? We live in a consumerist society. It's also a society that creates a deep longing for possessions, okay? Remember those Air Jordans that I talked about earlier? Well, I also remember that there was at least one instance, and I think there were multiple instances of teenagers being killed to get those Air Jordan shoes. See, some people can make themselves sick today because of a desire for material things. And we're not surprised about this because it's just a normal part of our life, but the truth is, it isn't normal. This is created by our society. But a consumer society is not just about material things, because at its foundation, it's a society that caters to our expectations that everyone else should fulfill our wants and wishes. And so the primary way we see ourselves in the world today is that we are consumers. When we're discontent, it's not that my expectations are out of whack. It's that the company or the group is at fault. It's never that my expectations are out of order. I should always be able to get what I want. Companies are built around this. Marketing is built around this. And oftentimes even churches are built around this. We promote our churches by showing people that we have the best band, the best sound, the best coffee, the best programs to meet all of your needs, and it will never be boring. Well, while our society might have taken this consumer impulse to an extreme, the truth is there has always been this sort of impulse to think about even things like faith in terms of how will this benefit me? And our passage from Matthew chapter 20 today that George read earlier is a great example of this. Now, what's happening here is Jesus just sat down to teach his disciples when James and John's mother went to Jesus to ask him for a favor. Now, I'm not sure what their mom was doing there. to tell you the truth. It seems kind of a strange thing to me. But the way James and John responded makes it seem like they kind of put her up to it. They were too afraid to ask Jesus themselves, and so they said, hey, Mom, could you ask Jesus if he would do this? In any case, this is their request or her request or whoever's it was in verse 21. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. Okay, now, at face value, who can blame them, right? I mean, they were just the ones who thought about it first. Good for them. You know, they're bold enough to ask for something like this. They just want to make sure that they are close to Jesus for all of eternity, right? So it seems like a pretty good thing. That's something that we should all want, right? That's something that Joan wanted. She wanted to be close to Jesus for all of eternity. But actually, that's not really what they were asking. You see, their request wasn't just about being close to Jesus. It was about being close to power and privilege and recognition. They wanted to be great. They wanted to be honored by the people around them above everyone else. And so this, of course, prompts Jesus to respond. He says, well, you don't really know what you're asking. And then he asks them this question. He says, can you drink from the cup that I am about to drink from? Okay, now, in the Old Testament, the cup is always a metaphor for suffering, sometimes judgment, but always suffering. And of course, Jesus had already told them that he was going to Jerusalem to die, and so they should have known at least what was going on, but you can tell they didn't really understand because of their confident and almost kind of flippant reply. Yeah, Jesus, of course we can do that. Give us the cup. Let's do this, right? And Jesus, of course, says, well, you're right. You will drink from this cup, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have the place of honor and privilege and power. You see, what his point was that followers of Jesus don't get a special status for suffering or for self-sacrifice, because suffering and self-sacrifice is the normal way of life for people in the kingdom. In fact, normal in his kingdom is different from normal anywhere else in the world. This past summer, Ann and I, many of you know this, had the privilege of going to Europe for a couple of weeks to celebrate our 30th anniversary. It was a great trip. The first place we went to was London. We flew in there. We stayed there for 5 days or so. And while we were there, we were absolutely shocked, appalled actually, that people there do not know how to drive. They were, can you believe it, driving on the wrong side of the road. I was just like, what is wrong with these people? Are there no police? You know, what's going on? They're driving on the wrong side of the road. Even the buses, even the trucks. Professional drivers, they should know better, shouldn't they? Of course, it was alarming because it made it really difficult to cross the street. When we are crossing the street here, we look left first and then we look right. But there, the cars that are coming from this way are right close by. And actually, even the authorities know that because they had things painted on the street saying, look this way. Literally, that's true. I'm actually thinking about moving there to become a missionary to help them learn how to drive better. Right? All right, so you can guess where I'm going with this, I suppose, right? The reason people drive on the left side of the road in London is because they live in a different kingdom, and they have a different way of life. Okay? We didn't even try to drive there because we knew that it would just be so confusing. We would just constantly be having to change how we thought when we were driving. Okay? When we drive here, we don't have to think about driving on the right side of the road. It's natural. It's instinct. Of course you drive on the right side of the road. Even when I'm walking on the sidewalk, if I'm coming up, meeting someone, I go to the right. That's the way it's supposed to be. They didn't always go to the right in London when they were walking anyway. Okay. We don't have to think about driving on the right because it's automatic, because this is the way we do things here. If we drove in London, we'd constantly be having to remind ourselves, okay, when I turn right, I've got to go into the far lane there, or how do I, and it's just almost an impossible task to do. All right, here's my point. is that what Jesus was about to describe is just as unnatural for us as driving on the other side of the road. See, for the disciples, just like it is for us, seeking comfort and power and privilege was so ingrained that when the rest of them heard about James and John's request, they were mad. And it started this big argument. You know, if we're going with the driving analogy, it was a 12-car pileup. So Jesus used the opportunity then to teach them about what is normal in his kingdom. And he starts in verse 25. He says, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them." In other words, you know, this is the way things work in the world. Then he says this. He says, "But not so with you." Now, I want you to understand the impact of this, okay? He's telling them that everything that they had learned about how to construct their life is wrong. If they want to be citizens of his kingdoms, then their priorities, their actions, their reactions, their instincts, every single bit of it needs to be reformed. And not only that, but if they were to live the way Jesus was requiring them to live, the direction of their life, the lane that they drove in, would actually cause them to be head on with the rest of their culture. Because following Jesus is not just about making little improvements to the way the world operates, it's a completely different country. So, what's different about Jesus' kingdom? Well, here's how Jesus describes it, starting in verse 26. He says, "Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." There's a philosophical debate that has been raging for years and years and years, centuries probably. And it centers around the question, is there a truly selfless act? Have you ever thought about that? Is there anything that is pure altruism? I guess that's the philosophical term, right? Now, as Christians, we believe that selflessness is a virtue. Okay, we measure a good action by not whether it's for our benefit, but whether it's for the benefit of someone else. But the question is, how far should we take this? For instance, would you volunteer to go to hell in the place of someone else? Your child, maybe. That would probably be the ultimate act of altruism, right? Would you volunteer to spend eternity separated from God so that someone else could be with him forever? It's a great question, isn't it? Okay, that's the extreme version of it. But on a more practical, everyday level, this question is whether you would sacrifice for someone else even if there was no discernible benefit for you. And we actually kind of assume that most people would not. We're always looking for benefits, right? That's why we motivate people to give to charity or to serve by telling them, if you give to my charity, not only will you help someone in need, but you'll feel good about doing it. Right? That's benefit for me. Isn't that self-interest? Am I really a good person if I do something so I feel good? All right, well, I hope I didn't send you into an existential crisis here. But just so you feel better, I'm going to actually settle the debate for you. Okay? And the reason I can say that is because Jesus actually answers the question. See, the truth is that Jesus was not against seeking rewards. He talked about it all the time. And he actually used it as a motivator for good actions. Let me give you some examples. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because what? Great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you." Here's another one, Matthew chapter 6. "When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret." You say, "Oh, well, he's not telling them to go for rewards. But then he goes on and he says this, then your Father who sees what is done in secret will do what? Will reward you. A little later in Matthew, he tells the parable of the hidden treasure. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. All right? He gave everything that he had, but why did he do that? To gain something even more, the kingdom of heaven. Okay, and so the question is not, should we be seeking a reward? The question is, what reward are we seeking? According to Jesus, the reward that we should be seeking is not what is valuable here in this temporary kingdom. Things like accumulation and ease and comfort and recognition. But he says we should be seeking eternal rewards. So, for instance, the problem with prosperity preaching is not that it encourages us to seek rewards, it just encourages us to seek the wrong kind of rewards. Of course, that brings us then to the second question. Well, how do we receive eternal rewards? Well, fortunately, Jesus tells us that too. And he does so by telling us, here's how the kingdom of God works. Here's how people are rewarded in the kingdom. Verse 26, instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. By the way, Christian theology says that Jesus actually did go to hell for people. He's not there now. But there it is. That's how the kingdom of heaven works. Now, let me tell you what Jesus is not saying. Okay? Jesus is not saying that you need to get all of your stuff together before you're invited to his kingdom, before he'll accept you. He's not saying that only people who have done enough good or have sacrificed enough are invited into his kingdom. Who you are and what you've done in the past does not matter. There are no background checks to get into the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus also says that pretty clearly that in his kingdom they drive on the other side of the road. Or maybe actually upside down. That's theologians talk about that, right? The upside down kingdom. In any case, when we decide to follow Jesus, we commit to living according to a completely different set of values. That's why Jesus says in Luke chapter 14, anyone who wants to build a tower will first sit down and count the cost, estimate the cost to see if he actually can go through with it. So we live in a world that urges us to climb the ladder, to look out for yourself, to do what makes you happy, to treat yourself. It tells us you deserve better. Well, if your treasure is here in this kingdom, that's pretty good advice, actually. But if you're seeking rewards in Jesus' kingdom, he actually says, whoever wants to be great must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. So what I'm saying is Jesus invites everyone to be a part of his kingdom, but when he does, he calls us to a new way of life that runs counter to the way of the world, especially the values of our consumer culture. Well, our consumer culture can oftentimes make church a big challenge because churches have oftentimes catered to this consumer mentality, bringing people in by giving them what they want, okay, by making them as individual the center of attention. And to some degree, that has to be the case. Okay, we have to meet people where they are. And actually, even Jesus did something like this, right? How did he reach people? Well, in many ways, he gave them what they wanted or what they needed. He healed them, he fed them, he freed them from evil spirits. He did signs and wonders. And he spoke in a way that connected with the common people. But he was also willing to challenge them. In fact, every time it seems like people were following him because of the magic show, he would say something challenging to see who was really committed to him. He appealed to them where they were, but his goal was actually to move them beyond that. And so he wasn't afraid to challenge them. And actually, that's the kind of church that we want to be. In fact, I think it's necessary. We can invite people in by helping people to have their needs and maybe even some of their wants met, whether real or imagined. Okay? But ultimately, the goal of the church is to disciple people into Christ-likeness and to disciple them into the mission of Jesus. And so if you have been here for a while and you never find yourself feeling uncomfortable, come and talk to me because something is wrong. Now, in the identity statement that we're going through, one of the things that we say is that we are called and empowered to give ourselves. To give ourselves. To give ourselves for what? Well, we say for the glory of God and the good of the world. In the last 2 weeks of our series, we'll unpack what that means. But I want to land the plane today by unpacking what it means practically to give ourselves. Okay, and we'll break it down in a way that, I don't know, you've probably heard it articulated this way before, that we have to be willing to give our time, our talent, and our treasure. Because this idea of giving ourselves can sound really sort of vague and ethereal. But there's actually a real practical component to it. Okay, so let's talk about these, and I'm going to take them in the reverse order that I said them. Okay, when we give ourselves, we have to be willing to give our treasure. Now, I'm starting here because I actually think this is the easiest. Okay, in our society that is wealthy, even middle-class people oftentimes have extra money laying around. I think a lot of times this can be the easiest for us. Okay, and here's what I'll say, is the foundation of this has to come with the realization of Psalm 24:1, that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Okay, everything in your possession is actually not yours. It was entrusted to you by the God who actually owns everything. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, toward the end of the chapter, it also says that God gives things generously to us, and some of it for our enjoyment, at least a portion of it. But the attitude of the world is, with our stuff, is that, well, you earned it, it's yours, and you should enjoy the fruit of your labor. But on the other hand, in Jesus' kingdom, the first question that we need to ask when we have money is how our possessions can be leveraged to serve God and the people around us. Okay, that means that first, I seek, when I'm creating my budget, that I intentionally set aside the first fruits to give to God. It also means when I get a raise, before I think about all of the things that I can get for myself that I couldn't get before, I consider how I can give where there is need. It means that I intentionally live below my means, that I create margins in my budget if it's possible, so that when a need comes up, I have money to contribute to that need. Okay? When we come to Christ, our possessions are primarily for service to Him and to His kingdom. And it's not just about checking off boxes, all right, tithe, check, offering, check, benevolence, check, okay? Giving is an attitude of the heart that results in holding our possessions loosely, with an open hand, where we can receive from God and we can give to others at the same time. Giving ourselves requires giving our stuff. Okay, so the question here would be, how are you being intentional about making what you have available to Jesus and His kingdom? Here's the second. Like I said, in many ways, in a wealthy country like ours, giving might be the easiest. That might not be true for you, okay? But God also gives us other things that we are to pass along to Him and to others. And one of those things, or two of those things, I guess, are our skills and talents. Now, of course, it's easy to see how we can use our talents within the church. If you have a musical gift, you can serve on the worship team. If you have the gift of hospitality, you can help greet people or create a welcoming environment on Sunday morning. If you're good at caring for others, Carolyn is putting together a pastoral care team to make sure that we do that well as a congregation. Do you connect with kids? Well, you can work with kids in Kids Park. If you can work on cars, you can serve at the free oil change day coming up on Saturday. We start at 8 o'clock. But this one is not just about filling roles within the church. This is about a completely different mindset shift wherever we are. Aaron McRunnell is heading up the oil change day because he's pretty handy with cars. I didn't ask for his permission for this, by the way, so I'm sorry if I embarrass. I asked his permission to head up the oil change day. But I didn't tell him I was going to talk about him this morning, so, all right? So he's heading up the oil change day. But what you probably don't know, because he doesn't really tell people this, is that he regularly uses his time and that talent to work on other people's cars. Sometimes he pays for the parts. He did this for a couple of people who have come to the oil change in the past. They, needed their car, and it was on its last legs without a repair, and so he said, okay, I'll do it. And he gave his time to do that. There was a car that was donated to Immigrant Connection that needed some repairs, and he did that too. Okay? He uses his talent because he knows that talent was not just given for him or for his family, although I bet you probably work on your own cars too, right? From time to time. But he knows that he's been given that talent for the sake of the kingdom. Here's another example. Back in my basketball playing days, which ended probably about a year and a half ago because I was tired of sore Achilles, I had a talent. And it's hard to see how, unless you're like in the NBA and you have a platform of 1 million followers or whatever, it's hard to see how you can use that talent for the sake of the kingdom. But for me, it put me into contact with guys that I wouldn't otherwise be in contact with. Okay, and now, I'm a competitive guy. I don't like to lose, and in the past, that would, let's just say, cause me to act in ways that were contrary to my faith when I was younger. Okay, if winning, or if proving that I'm the best is my main goal, then that's what happens, because I have a lot at stake. But over the past few years, each time I went, I reminded myself that winning was not my number one goal in going to the gym. Yes, the skills that God gave me were good for exercise, good to, get rid of some stress and things like that. But it also provided me the opportunity to know some guys, to pray for them, to do pastoral care with them, to talk to them about Jesus while I was there at the gym waiting to get into a game. And I had to start to remind myself of this, that God has given me this gift, and it's not just so I can show how great I am at basketball. It's to get me into contact with these guys who wouldn't step foot in the doors of a church. Okay, that's a change of mindset for all of us. Like the Apostle Paul writes, he says, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And so the question is what talents do you have that you can give to God and his kingdom? Be creative. Okay? You might not be able to see, how God might be able to use your talent, but pray about it and say, all right, how do you want to use this talent for your kingdom? All right, last one, time. And I use this one last because I think this one may be the most difficult in our society. Giving ourselves requires giving our time. Now, we don't always think about time as something that we give because mostly we think about time as something that happens to us, that we don't have a lot of control over it. And because of that belief, then God oftentimes gets our leftover time. Too often, our attitude is, well, I'll give God time when I have time to spare. But he wants us to be intentional about how we use it and leverage that time for his kingdom. Let me just give a couple of examples of how this works itself out. One of the ways that a consumer mindset creeps into the church is what I have come to call, and I think this is original with me, but with what I call the I love my church phenomenon. Now I'm going to use the example of Immigrant Connection because actually it seems like we could get we could be approved any time now. When we first started considering Immigrant Connection, we had to be approved with the DOJ, and it was taking like 20 to 24 months. Well, Emma went to the national conference this past week, and she said that there are some sites that are being approved in 3 weeks, and we put our application in about 3 weeks ago. So I'm not guaranteeing that it'll happen, but it seems like it won't be long. Anyway, I'm going to use this example because nobody has had the opportunity to volunteer for it yet, all right? And so you can't say that I'm picking on you, all right? There have been many of you who have expressed a lot of excitement about Immigrant Connection, and rightfully so. I'm one of them. And in fact, for some of you, it was kind of the deciding factor to stick around when you started coming to the church. I've heard people who have been here a long time say things like, I love my church. I'm so glad that I get to be a part of a church that does this kind of thing. Okay? And I've also heard that, by the way, when people are talking about things like, how we address racial justice and reconciliation, the Easter egg hunt, Together for Good, and, other ministries. I am so glad that I get to be a part of a church that does X. And I've heard it at other churches too. But then when the time comes to actually do the work, only a handful of people show up. This is a consumer mindset. And again, this is not to pick on anyone in particular, but the I love my church phenomenon is a constant temptation for churchgoers in our consumerist society. Too often, people want the reputation that comes with being a church that does good things, but we're not really willing to put in the time. This is also true outside the church as well, when it comes to how we prioritize our time. And I found this to be especially challenging when we had kids at home. I guess we do have one at home still, but he kind of does his own thing now. But I always found it challenging. And there are many of you who are parents who are not quite to this point. Some of you are in the throes of it right now. Okay, but if you're not to this point now, you'll experience it at some point. In fact, I think it's even harder today than when we were raising our kids. And it's this, is that you will experience pressure for your kids to excel in things that are fun and in many ways good for them, but the time commitment becomes disproportionate to their kingdom value. Okay, now, I grew up playing sports. I grew up doing music and that, but we didn't have all the opportunities for traveling teams that people have today, whether sports or music or robotics or chess team or you name it. There's a traveling team for it today. And all of these things are good. I think they can develop character, they can develop discipline, talent, friendships, all of that. But if you're not careful, rather than a life centered on Christ and his kingdom, the activities will begin to consume you. Now, like I said, you can use all of these platforms to serve God and your neighbors, but they'll be kind of like playing with matches if you don't set your mind intentionally toward service to Christ and his kingdom. So the question here is how are you being intentional about giving your time to Christ and his kingdom? All right, well, I know that this creates a lot of real dilemmas for us. And we would like to have easy answers for how we or formulas for how much of our time or talent or treasure we should give to the kingdom and how much we can just use for leisure time or because we enjoy it. And there's really not a formula other than we should give all of it. But there isn't an easy answer for what it looks like practically. It really comes down to making a shift in our mind, to making a shift from a consumer mindset that continually seeks rewards here to a mindset that says, as a follower of Jesus, I am committed, I am called to give my life to the one I say I follow, Jesus. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have to intentionally make that shift long enough so that it eventually becomes second nature. Okay, you have to, in order to learn to drive on the other side of the road, you have to drive on the other side of the road and probably do it for a long time. Because you're trying to relearn new patterns, new ways of thinking. It can't just be in your mind, it has to be new habits. It has to be new priorities, new way of living, and we act our way into a new way of thinking. And it'll be hard at first, and it will feel unnatural, and sometimes it will even feel unfulfilling because you're trying to develop new habits. See, giving ourselves always starts with a discipline, but eventually it becomes a craving. For instance, one of the things that I shared with my small group yesterday is the way I feel about treasure. Many times in my life, I've had buyer's remorse, but never once have I had giver's remorse. But I think that's something that is learned over time. And so what we have to do is we have to learn to become someone who finds more pleasure in serving others than in serving ourselves, to find more joy in giving than receiving. We actually get to serve Christ and his kingdom. So I think the ultimate question today is, or really two of them, are this. Number one, is your life guided more by a consumer mindset or a giving mindset? Or two, what might you need to change to bring your life into alignment with Christ's call to serve? Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the way it challenges us. And sometimes that's hard to say, very practically. Thank you for the challenge. But there's, I think, a real truth in our faith, and that is that we know that you are much more concerned about our character than our comfort. And so, God, as we consider what this means, and as we live in the tensions of how we use our time, or how we use our treasure, or how we use our talents, God, would you give us wisdom? And I pray that even as we discipline ourselves to live, to drive on the other side of the road, so to speak, that you would help it to become automatic for us. And even more so, I pray that we would find joy in looking forward to the eternal rewards. May we be people who seek your kingdom first. And whatever blessings we receive here, that we enjoy them, that we receive them with gratitude, but that we hold them with an open hand so that we might continue to give the way you gave to us. We pray this in Jesus' name.